Good morning, everyone. I'm Kevin Allen, and I'm joined by my usual broadcast partner, former NHL defenseman Tom Laidlaw, who played for 11 seasons with the New York Rangers and Los Angeles Kings. And our special guest today on the Laidlaw and Allen Report is Bob Duff, noted writer and hockey historian, the author of many books for years. Of course, he was the columnist for the Windsor Star, and he and I also do a podcast on Tuesdays and Thursdays on hockeydebates.com. Welcome to the show, Bob.
Well, it's my pleasure to join you two esteemed human beings today.
Bob, I need to ask you, Bob, what has it done to your life now that you do a show with Kevin Allen? Like, has that improved your lifestyle? Or
geez, here we go.
I get stopped on the street all the time by people, and they just say, "What, are you out of your mind working with that guy?"
When I go to Windsor, I just drop Bob's name, which is true, even at the border. I once dropped his name, and it really served me well because one of the guys there said he played hockey with. I said I play hockey with Bob Duff. Yeah. I thought he would say I know him from the Windsor Star, but he said he played hockey with him.
One of the most astute moves I've made in my life was I became the goalie for the Canada Border Service hockey team. So it's made my life crossing the border quite smooth.
Nice. Yeah. Well, it's helped me at least on one occasion. It did, so I appreciate that.
I'm going to start using Bob. I'm going to start using Bob's name now too. Then.
Yeah. One of the reasons I wanted to have Bob as a guest today is that we lost one of the great hockey writers of our generation and the previous generation, Bob, in the loss of Frank Orr, who the longtime Toronto-based writer who passed away over the weekend. And I know you knew him reasonably well, and I kind of want to get your thoughts on his passing.
Well, I mean, I posted a thing on Facebook about, when I was a youngster, maybe I want to say 7, 8 years old. Every Thursday afternoon, there was a bookmobile that would come to our neighborhood, and you could go and sign out books. It was like a portable library. And one of the first hockey books I ever read was one I signed out of that bookmobile. It's called Hockey Scrapbook, and it was written by Frank Orr, and it was little vignettes about NHL players. I want to say it was like the 68-69 season maybe, so you had guys like Cesar Maniago and Danny O'Shea and Bruce Gamble. And Frank, the thing that struck me about Frank's writing even then was he wasn't looking to make friends with the players. Like he referred to Bruce Gamble as Toronto's portly netminder. I don't think Bruce would have appreciated reading that in the book, but anyway, that always struck me about Frank. And as I was lucky enough, back in the days when newspapers actually spent money, and I was working at the Windsor Star, they frequently would send me up to Toronto to do coverage of the Leafs, and I got to know Frank quite well. And we would go out for lunch, often be after a practice, or have a meal before a game, and no one could spin a yarn like Frank. I mean, a lot of them I couldn't repeat here in public airwaves, but he had a unique way of expressing himself. And one of the funniest stories I ever heard about Frank was it was one of the Olympic Games, I believe, and there was a bunch of American writers and a bunch of Canadian writers. I'm not sure which Olympics it was. I can't. But anyway, it was in the days when most Canadian newspapers were still afternoon editions, so they had a very late deadline, like 3 a.m. Well, most of the American papers had gone to AM deadlines, so they were on crunch time right after the game. So apparently right after the game, all the American writers were telling the Canadian writers, to keep it down. We're trying to deadline here, behave yourselves. We don't need your distractions, and really being obnoxious to the Canadian writers. Well, then they all got their stories filed, and in those days you could get yourself a beer in the press box, which you can't anymore, but in those days you certainly could. And the American writers decided to celebrate the fact that they'd made deadline and were having a bit of a carousing time in the press box. Well, now the Canadian writers were on deadline, and they needed the quiet. So Frank Orr, in his none too subtle way, turned to one of the other writers and said loudly, "Is ugly American capitalized?"
That's the thing I'm going to remember about Frank Orr. I sat near him in the press box at a lot of big events because, I was covering big events as the nation's hockey writer at USA Today, and he was at a lot of big events because he was Frank Orr. So we ended up sitting next to each other. And he would be relatively quiet, and then out of the blue, he was one of the quickest witted and real dry sense of humor.
Yeah.
And you'd be sitting there, and there'd be a huge guy on, I'd say, it's Dane Chara, or I think first time I ever heard it, it was Eric Lindros, and he'd say, I bet on horses that are smaller than that guy. And and then he just would have me laugh, or he would, he'd be watching the Maple Leafs, and he'd say, "Is effed up hyphenated?"
One of my favorites was Tiger Williams came in second pretty badly in a fight one night, and Frank said, "He looks like he ran the 100-meter dash in a 90-yard building."
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, well,
go ahead. Kev, for me, the biggest thing for me as a player, growing up around the Toronto area, seeing his writings all the time. And then when you're finally make it to the NHL and you're in the locker room and Frank Orr's talking to you, it's like, wow, I actually made it, right? Like, it was just like a signal, like that Frank Orr was that big of a name that kind of signified that you made it to the league. He was good.
Well, and he was huge. Like, to me, there are a lot of really quality writers that were covering the sport when I first started covering it. Some of the last the previous generation were still around. Franny Rosa in Boston, and there were a lot of guys. George Gross was still around. There was a lot of really good Jimmy Proudfoot, a lot of good quality people covering the league. But there were two icons, and at least in my book, there was Red Fisher and there was Frank Orr, and I saw. Those guys couldn't have been more different. Red could be a bit surly, and he'd sit next in it. It'd be a while. You had to really earn your stripes before Red even talked to you. He always had that thing where he said, "I don't talk to rookies." Well, he was kind of like that with writers too. Like, he didn't open up conversation if you were, if he thought you were kind of on a temporary assignment in hockey. But once you'd been there for a while, he was fun to talk to, and I got to know him actually quite well, and had some interesting conversations. Well, Frank Orr, the minute you sat down, I don't care who you were, he was interested in talking to you. So, they were really, kind of a different pair, but both of them were incredibly gifted. And, Bob's analysis of, he was subtle in his digs, and he was funny. So, that allows you, like, you got to find a way, if you're going to dig at players, to do it in such a way that you're not overly threatening. Like John Davidson is a good example. When he was an analyst, if he wanted to criticize the way a player was performing, he wouldn't just get on him directly about the play. He'd say something like, "Oh," he goes, he knows he could have made a better play." Right. Yeah, he'd
compliment him too. He'd say, "That guy's a really good player, but yeah, he probably want to do that one over again." Yeah. He would just find a way to do it, and there's an art form, and Frank Orr was sort of masterful at that as well. But when someone needed to be taken to the woodshed, he took them there. But he was always, his humor came through, in his writing at all times. I remember in the I think it was the Anaheim Detroit series. He was talking. I think it actually appeared in print too, but he said it in the press box beforehand, where he said, "This is dumping chase without the chase." Which was so true. Like, he was an amazing fellow, and we lost, I think, a lot of good writing through the years from him, because in his later years, he wasn't able to write. Did he have a stroke, Bob? I don't.
I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I know he was ill toward the end of his life. I know he was in a rest home at the end. But to me, what always struck me about Frank was you look at writers today, and so many of them are trying to build a brand. They want to get on television, they want to be on ESPN or Hockey Night in Canada or whatever sport they're in. They want to get on that network that covers that sport and kind of be a multitasker, multimedia star. And with Frank's wit, he probably would have been a star on television, but he had no interest in it. He was a writer, and that's what he wanted to do. He didn't want to, he didn't want to branch out and become this mega star. He was quite happy with his lot in life and enjoyed what he did.
Yeah, Mark Spector, who I find to be always pretty insightful in his columnizing, said on a tweet that Frank Orr taught his colleagues and his brethren how to enjoy the profession they were in. And I thought that was a fair comment. Like, Frank Orr loved being a sports writer.
Yeah.
And he loved the craft. He loved being part of it. He liked all the what went into it. And, he might complain about it, but, he wouldn't have wanted to do anything else. And I always appreciated that about him. You do run across people who act as if, this is such a chore. And I always want to say, well, then, get out of here. Don't do this, because most of us who did it really did enjoy it. And no one sort of summed that up more than Frank Orr, who, enjoyed being at the games, enjoyed kibitzing with his, colleague, making acerbic, comments about what was going on. And he liked pretty much everything about it.
I can remember one time, would have been in the mid 90s, I want to say. And the way the schedule had fallen, the Leafs were going to play the Kings the next night, and the Kings were already in town. So the Leafs practiced, then the Kings practiced. And then right after them, the Avalanche had played the Leafs the night before, and they were going on to Buffalo, but they decided to practice in Toronto and then go to Buffalo. So we had 3 practices in a row. And a lot of the writers were griping about, what a long day it was. And Frank was like, this is gold, like there's so much opportunity here to find stuff out and, unearth stories. And, he looked upon it as an opportunity. Like, how often do you get to access 3 teams in the same day?
Yeah, very true. And he was good. Was he from the Toronto area originally?
I think he was originally from a small town in Ontario, and he came to Toronto. I'm not sure the exact his hometown, but I know I'm pretty sure he came from a pretty small town in Ontario originally.
It is interesting that we're talking about him too. I do remember going into Maple Leaf Gardens, being that Brampton kid right outside of Toronto, and seeing him it was like the whole thing, like being in Maple Leaf Gardens. That's where I watched so many games as a kid, and then talking to Frank Orr, it was like it was really exciting to talk to Frank Orr, and he was funny to talk to too. It was good.
Well, the first time I ever covered a Leaf game when I was a year out of college, and I was working part time, and most kids go to the rink. They want to see, whether it's Daryl Sittler or, whoever the star was, Salming. I was in awe because here I am working alongside, Frank Orr and Trent Frayne and Dick Beddoes and Jim Proudfoot and John Iaboni, all these guys I grew up reading and, I wanted to be a sports writer. So those were my idols. I wasn't idolizing the players as much as I was idolizing the writers. And now here I am working beside them.
Yeah.
Frank was good friends with Jim Kernahan of the London Free Press. And I got to know Jim when I was in the Port Huron because, London wasn't that far from Port Huron. And if we had any kind of event going on, like Red Wings training camp, Jim would come down and I got to know him. And, back then, the travel schedules, even in London, Ontario, like Jim went all over the world. He covered Olympics and World Cups and everything. And both of those guys were kind of cut from the same cloth. I could see why they were friends because Jim was funny as well and loved what he was doing. And much like Frank, he was very congenial. He always had time for young writers, and we've lost him too. He passed away several years ago, but it was easy to see why they were such good friends. There's no doubt about that.
I think the fact that they didn't have ego is what struck me. And I'm sure they were proud of their accomplishments, but me as a young writer starting out, people like Dick Beddoes and Trent Frayne and Frank Orr were happy to help me out and offer advice and, kind of show you the ropes. And, that's really impressive because they were the biggest stars in the Canadian media.
And not only would they, offer you advice, but they would just talk to you like you're having a regular conversation. Frank always was interested in what I was up to and, would always, ask me what I'd been, where I had been, what I had done, what was going on, that kind of thing. He liked just chatting with people.
One time we were out for lunch after a Leaf practice, and we got talking about some of the all-time greats, the Howie Morenzas and the Newsy Lalondes, the guys from the early years of the NHL, and I just happened to say, it would have been wonderful to get to see those guys play in person, and Frank just said, where I'm going someday, I'm hoping I get to watch all of them play, and, now I hope he's up there watching them play right now.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, Bob, before we let you go, it would be remiss if we could get your thoughts on what has happened around the league. Obviously, COVID, you and I have talked about it on our show a lot. but I'm of the mind that even though I expected, because of being able to watch the NFL, that we were going to have issues, I didn't think they would be as severe as they've been for us. Your thoughts?
Well, I think because of the time of year, I mean, under normal non-pandemic circumstances, this is the time of year when there'd usually be a flu bug or something would go through the dressing room. It seemed like every season, every team would deal with that at some point. And it seems like this year, every team's going to deal with the pandemic coming through their dressing room. It seems like we've had now, I don't know how many teams. But one thing that I find very fascinating is there hasn't been one of the North Division, the Canadian teams haven't been gutted by this yet. It's all been the American teams. And it's kind of, I don't, people think we're doing a great job here in Canada, but I don't think we're doing that much better than Americans at handling it. We've just reopened again in Ontario, and, they're talking about this new wave coming through, and we're reopening all our businesses again. So, it's like we're inviting it back in.
Well, here in New York now, too, they've made it so they can have 10% capacity of all sporting events. And same thing, these new waves coming in, new strains coming in from Africa and all these different places. So you kind of wonder what's the truth, what to believe and what not to believe.
Well, Bob, we appreciate having you on. And as I mentioned before, to our viewers, Bob and I have a podcast, hockeydebates.com, usually at about 4 o'clock on every Tuesday and Thursday. So check us out. We get into all kinds of debates and conversations about what's going on in the league.
Great to see you, Bob. You know what, Bob? Maybe you and I should do a show. We'll just call it the Kevin Allen Show, and you and I talk about Kevin Allen behind his back.
Just tell tales about Kevin. I mean, some of them are so out there, no one will believe they're really true.
Okay.
Yeah. Bob and I used to drive to the Maple Leaf games. I'd stop in Windsor, and then we'd go up, and usually on the way back, because we had to ride, be 1 o'clock in the morning. Bob would always drive, and I'd fall asleep in the front seat.
There you go. There you go. Good to see you, Bob.
Yeah, good to see you, Bob. See you later.
Oops, got wrong guy. Sorry about that. I was trying to get rid of Kevin.
that was pretty funny. Yeah, you got rid of the wrong guy.
It is interesting to talk about Frank Gore. Listen to those old stories that you told. Obviously, you knew him a lot better than I did, and Bob did as well. But it really is true. It was like it's almost funny now thinking back about how excited I was to actually be talking to Frank Gore when I turned pro.
Yeah, well, I was excited too. He was he was big. He was a star. He never acted like a star, but he was a star in the journalism world, and everybody knew that he was one of the best. And it was like he was the Gretzky or Lemieux. Red Fisher and he were both such stars. In terms of our profession, and but he just carried himself like. He was a team guy, and he just,
Did you ever have to deal with any kind of like Canadian bias? Like you're a U.S. guy coming in. Did anybody ever see like guys you don't know what you're talking about? You're from the U.S.
Well, you'd sense it more than it wouldn't be direct, but I always thought there was kind of a subtle, form of of arrogance, from the Canadian writers. Like they, when you were an American writer, we joked that the Canadian writers thought that they had invented the game.
Yes.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
That would,
especially when you get started, right? When so many years ago too, right?
Yeah, no, that was right in the 1980s. It was interesting. My predecessor, the late Rod Beaton, who ended up going to baseball, he told me, he said, you're just because you're such a hockey guy, you're going to end up, hanging out with the Canadian writers, but. It's not sort of what happened. It wasn't that I didn't like the Canadian writers, because I did. I was friendly with them. But it turned out that I just connected to some of the, terrific U.S. writers, Jim Kelly in Buffalo, Kevin DuPont, in Boston. These are guys from my generation. And they were, terrific hockey writers in their own right, and so I ended up, getting to know them better, and I knew all the, Bob Fachet. You have to remember him from the Washington Post.
Yeah.
Around, but Bob was a little grumpy, but I got along great with him. I remember we were probably like the odd couple because we were an unlikely pairing. But once we were covering the playoffs in Edmonton, because I used to spend my springs in Edmonton every spring in Edmonton in the 1980s, because I covered the Oilers when they were making their run. So you'd have an off day, and I remember Bob and I went to Banff, which is to me the prettiest place on the earth.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And we just had such a great time together. And I bet politically our approaches to life couldn't have been more opposite, but we had a wonderful time that game. Went out to, there's a golf course there, had a great lunch place there at the golf course, overlooked I think it was the 10th tee, and there was a big backup on the 10th tee at this golf course, and like 20 foursomes waiting to tee off. And I said to the waiter, like, what's going on? Why aren't these guys going? And he goes, the moose are grazing. And I said, how long will the moose graze? He said, as long as they want.
This is Banff? That was Banff?
Banff, up in Banff at the golf
course.
That's
beautiful. That's a great part of the country.
Oh yeah, that's one. That's the one thing. I've taken my wife to a lot of the places I've been. She used to meet me after the Olympics, but I've not been able to take her to Banff. We just have never worked it out, and that's just such a tremendous place. And I think Glenn Sather owns about half of it, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does.
That's the kind of the rumor. So anyway, I wanted to talk to you about a few things in hockey here. I actually made some notes, which is more than I usually do for this kind of thing. But let me see.
When's the outdoor game in Tahoe? When is that?
It's later this month. Yeah, I don't know the exact date, but it's certainly later this month. But I remember what I was going to talk to you about. Erik Karlsson. You want to believe in the Sharks. You look at their roster, and there's some skilled players on that team, and I think you're perplexed. Is that fair to say about why they're not better than they are?
Yeah, them in Nashville, two teams that should be a lot better based on what they have in the locker room. Yep.
Yeah. I'm kind of wondering. I was looking at Karlsson's stats, and I've been reading, kind of the San Jose media kind of discussing him, and he is really off to a slow start. 4 assists is all he has in 13 games. I saw he played only 18 minutes in his last game, and he just is not the same player. He's only 30 years old.
Yeah.
He's 30 years old. He's got 6 years remaining on a contract paying him $11.5 million of a cap hit.
Yep.
Is it time to panic over that contract?
I think it's way past time to panic. He's one of those guys, and I hate to say it, that he's been so good. Like some of those times in Ottawa, he played against the Rangers one year in the playoffs, and he was unbelievable.
Yeah.
But the problem with him is it's the Erik Karlsson show. Like I should say it this way: as long as it is the Erik Karlsson show, then everything's fine. But when he's not, it's either he's all or nothing. It seems like with him. I questioned that move when they signed him. I questioned the move when they traded for him. They already had Burns there. So usually you don't have, not many teams have two high-powered offensive defensemen like those two guys. We talked about Hedman the other day being a rover. Those two guys are like that too. Well, the problem with those guys is they're not as good defensively. I just think that, to me, I think he needs to be someplace else where he is more of the man. I think with Burns there, I think there's only one puck, and those guys each need a puck. So, I think it drags the rest of the team down. Like you said, it's a big chunk of your cap. And I think he's got that big personality, too. I don't think he's a bad guy from what I understand, but he's got that
he's a good guy. I like Erik Karlsson.
Yeah.
I've talked to him quite a few times, and he's just a delight
to
talk to. So.
Yeah, it's certainly that same thing as Nashville. That it just doesn't seem the mix in that locker room just doesn't seem to be right. I mean, ever since Pavelski left, and I don't know if he was that big of a leader on the team. It appears he was, because they don't seem to have it at all right now. Yeah,
well, I think a lot of people were kind of shock's the wrong word, but mildly surprised that the loss of Pavelski impacted the team as much as it did. Not that Pavelski wasn't a good player, but I think people thought there was enough there that they'd be able to overcome the loss of Pavelski, but they really have not been the same since.
Yeah, and Thornton too. Again, I didn't really view Joe Thornton as that big of a leader, but I guess he not in the Mark Messier, Steve Yzerman sense, right?
But he's really good in the room. You could feel it, like when you went into the room, just with the way he carried himself and walked around, and you'd hear from players. Everybody liked Joe.
Yeah, totally.
And I remember talking when I did Jeremy Roenick's book with him, and he had a lot of time. I mean, his problems with Patrick Marleau are well documented. They were in the book as well. But he loved Joe Thornton,
right?
He just thought the world of him.
What were the problems with Patrick Marleau?
They just didn't get along. He just didn't. For whatever reason.
I did hear stories, and again, I've tried to be. I don't want to give too many details. I've heard stories about how they wanted to do team things together. The rest of the team did, and Marleau wouldn't do it. Right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And I mean, that's how
Well,
Jeremy.
you kind of wonder then, and I hate to say it because he's a former player, but I mean, the general manager there, Doug Wilson, how long is that going to last? I mean, that team had its run for a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think part of being a GM is you got to manage your ownership.
Yeah.
Totally. And I think Doug always has managed his ownership. He's one of those guys that, we talked about carrying yourself like Joe Thornton. I think Doug Wilson carries himself well. I think he's done a really good job. Like a lot of people, there were years there when they the Sharks didn't go to the cap. They'd be $3 or $4 million under, and nobody paid any attention to it. But if you're the owner and you're asking your guy to stay, just a little bit under, well, that money is money that goes in their pocket. Yeah. You know what I mean? If you could stay $3 or $4 million under and be competitive, and I think Doug did that for a while.
Yeah, very true.
So yeah, that's Sharks team. I'm not as big a believer, even though, I almost root is too strong, but I would like to see Nashville do well because I enjoy going there. It's a fun place. I like David Poile. I would like to see him win. He's worked real hard and he's never won. But to be honest, I don't like that team that David has built there. Nothing that, and he's always been, even though he's cast as this very conservative general manager, he's far from that. He's one of the more aggressive general managers in the league. His personality is true, conservative. Personality-wise, he is conservative. But, look at the bold trades he made. Straight up, Seth Jones for Ryan Johansson.
Way back to the Washington days, we traded for
Wayne. Right? Yeah, all that stuff. He brought in Forsberg. He brought in Korea. He has worked real hard. He's brought in some unpopular.
Yeah. Shea Weber for PK Subban.
Yeah. Like he's bold. Totally. But I didn't think he did enough this summer. I like Roman Josi, and I like Ryan Ellis. That's a nice start of a defense, and I like Ekholm too, who's injured, by the way. But I like those guys. But beyond that, I sort of like Forsberg, but I don't love that team.
I know. Johansson is way underperforming, and I like him as a player. When he's played the way he can, he's really good. I like him a lot. Matt Duchene, I just don't, it's awful saying this, but I just don't see Duchene as like a real good team guy. And again, I don't know him. It's just from the actions I've seen playing the game. I just wonder if there's too many of those guys like they're big name, like star players that are on that team making big money. What moves can he make? Like, would somebody trade for, if he wanted to, would somebody trade for Johansson or Matt Duchene right now with the contracts you're making? I don't know if I would, right?
No, you can't trade those guys right now. Just like San Jose can't trade Erik Karlsson at $11 million for 6 more years. You got to live with those, players. And but I didn't think they got any better. Basically, Craig Smith was moved out. Craig Smith was a 20 goal scorer, and Eric Haula moves in. They added Cousins. Which is there's nothing wrong with that, adding in your bottom six, but it's not enough to change the direction of the team.
And look at the goal differential. It's 16 goals less scored. And they don't. I think Detroit's the only team worse than them at 18, minus 18. So, that team you look at, go, it's just no way. Well, the worst team in the league. Worst team in the league is Ottawa at minus 30. But
Yeah, I mean those three teams are at the bottom now in terms of they just Detroit and Nashville just finished a 2-game set, and they split, which just seemed quite appropriate. They're both teams, but I don't. The other thing I want to ask you about as well is, and I know you're not a big believer in plus minus, and I'm in agreement with you on that. That's often a team statistic.
Yeah.
But there's some odd things that are happening this season. I just happen to notice some guys on some good teams, have some bad numbers. Seth Jones on Columbus, team it's hard to play against. Tortorella is the coach. Seth Jones is one of my favorite players. He's minus 11. Now, you don't see other guys on that team minus 11. Now, the argument is, he plays against everybody and he plays a lot of minutes.
Right.
But he's not alone. John Carlson, Washington, minus 9. This is a guy that's not a minus player.
He's
not your favorite, but he's not usually minus. So
but he's not a very good defensive player. I mean, he's one of those guys that as long as he's got the puck, he's great. I think. See, with Seth Jones, I'd be more concerned because I do think he's a good defensive player.
Yeah, he is.
All around guy.
Bo Horvat, captain of the Canucks, minus 8.
Ooh.
Yeah. Now Quinn Hughes, who was I think last time I checked, he was the highest scoring defenseman in the game. Yeah. He's way minus. I can't remember now. Minus 14, 15. Now that team is struggling, and Quinn Hughes is playing his heart out. And he's a young player. And I'm trying to think. I think Tanev played with him last year, and then Tanev ended up in Calgary. And Tanev is one of those guys that sort of played the game like he's a reincarnation of Bob Goldham, who is tethered to his net, So he was like a good fit for Quinn Hughes. Let Quinn do his thing, and then all that. And then he doesn't have him this year. But there's I'm forgetting a few other players, but there's a bunch of examples of that this year, which just seems odd.
I think there's different reasons. Like I look at Seth Jones, and I love his game. I think he's a real competitor too. And I think sometimes those competitive guys, when the game gets close, they're down a goal, he's trying to make something happen, right? And a lot of times when you're trying to make something happen, you're going to get burned. You're going to get scored against. For me, like Tortorella isn't going to, if he's not playing well, Tortorella's just not going to play him. He doesn't care who he is. I mean, he benched Laine in the first game, right? So that big schmozzle over that. So I think there's different reasons. I think some guys like a Carlson in Washington, I don't view him as that solid as a defensive guy. So if he's minus, it's more because, you're turning the puck over or there's something going on. I think with the guys like a Seth Jones, who's that competitive guy, he may be more minus because he's maybe tried to do too much. But
there's some logic to that, as much as I want to make fun of you for saying if Seth Jones goes bad, it's not his fault. But if Carlson,
we didn't say it's his fault. It's positive. It's a positive.
It's a positive that he's minus 11. But John Carlson is just an indication of what kind of player he truly is. So.
It's pretty easy to tell who I like as players and who I don't, right? Is that what you're trying to say?
You wear your heart on your sleeve. To be honest with you, I shouldn't kid with you on that because I know exactly what you're saying. And it's easier for really good players to become minus because they're always out there playing against the best players on the other team. Yeah. So if mistakes happen, and it may not be their mistakes, they're going to get that minus because they're always out there. When if they're playing, they wouldn't play Boston this year, but if they're playing the Tampa Bay Lightning and Braden Point gets 4 points in a game, Seth Jones probably going to be minus 3 because he's going to be out there against that line.
Well, I'd like to see some of those numbers. Like how many times late in the game does Columbus pull the goaltender and Seth Jones is out there now he gets scored against, and that's that happens 5 times.
Another odd statistic that I saw, and this one I think is a head scratcher. The average save percentage over the last 2 or 3 years has just gone down a point.
Our friend Steve Cherndorf here, he's kind of he jumps right in there. I keep thinking he's kind of slamming you there, Kevin. I think.
I don't think we're trying to draw any conclusions. I think we're just noting that early on he's been bad. But saying that, I think the one thing that does need to remind everyone that usually when you're at the 15 game mark, you're, there's a lot of hockey to be left to be played.
Yeah, just get going. Yeah.
Yeah. 15 game now, we're pushing toward the quarter pole mark.
Yeah.
Already. And, I've seen GMs kind of remind that, this isn't as early as we think it is.
Right.
I'm in, and you see it in other ways as well. Like I'm in a fantasy hockey league, and already teams are making bold trades as if it's the middle of the season. Some teams are saying, "Oh, I'm out of it." So
that's a good point. So let's go back to the two teams we talked about before, Nashville and San Jose in particular. We're getting to the point where, Nashville's closer, but San Jose is like falling out of it quickly. What are you going to do with those teams then? I mean, if they stay where they are,
there's nothing you can do.
Yeah.
Because there's not enough the guys you really need to move out.
Yeah. Because you can't. So how are you going to rebuild, right? You can't rebuild with those contracts, those guys, unless you start taking part of the contracts back, right?
Well, yeah. Now you got that's above Doug Wilson's pay grade.
Yeah.
If you're starting to say, okay, let's just say 6 years left, 11.5, 66 million. Are you going to buy? You're not going to buy them out. That's just a waste of 40-some million. So. How much would you take back? Would you take back half? Now you're still eating 30 million.
Right. No. If I'm another GM, am I going to take, let's say Erik Karlsson, for instance, am I going to take Erik Karlsson, even if they take half of it? So let's say there's $6 million a year left at 6 years. Do you want Erik Karlsson at $6 million a year for another 6 years? The way he's playing now?
Not the way he's playing this season.
Right.
No, not. And like I said, he's only 30. Guys are playing longer.
Yeah.
Zdeno Chara is 107 years old. He's out there just playing really, really strong.
But and that's a good point. But Chara has always worked at his craft. Right?
Well,
he's always took it better.
Not always, but in the last decade.
Yeah.
I remember Tuukka Rask telling me that he's a better skater. At that point, it was in his late 30s. We were having this interview. Late 30s than he was early in his career. He just worked and worked and worked and worked at it. And and later in his career, he's even changed his diet. I don't know that he's a vegetarian, but I don't think he eats too much.
But his workouts are phenomenal too. Yeah, he really works it. Yeah. So what happens with those two franchises then? I mean, where do you go?
Well, you're going to take your lumps for a while. I think. You can't. What you can do. And to me, this is the trickiest thing. It's what LA's trying to do now. They have not that Anze Kopitar was not playing well because he's still a top player, but they had the contracts of him and Drew Doughty, those are big contracts. They're hard to move. I don't care how well they're playing. So you're trying to build around them.
Yeah, that's right. You're going to get high draft picks, right? Because that's going to be the thing for those two teams. You're going to get high draft picks now if they stay where they're at. So if they draft properly and develop the players, then they should do well. Right? So I guess, you got to rebuild with those guys on there. But man, the culture you're building there on that team. I mean,
that's one of the issues of longer term contracts. There's the good and the bad. If it's a good player and you end up having them for more long term, but if they don't earn out, and that's for as long as I can remember, the rub of professional sports has been teams are frequently guilty of paying on the basis of what a player has done as opposed to what he may do.
Chicago with Kane and Taves.
Yeah. You get to the point where these players are well established that they're good players. So at age 29 or 28 in the NHL, it's 27. You reward them with a contract that, pays them into their 30s when they're not going to be able to sustain that for that length of time unless they're Zdeno Chara or, Gretzky was critical.
Here's what I got to ask you your opinion on. So did you see the Tampa Bay boat parade they had?
Yeah.
So did you see Tom Brady's trophy toss?
I did. What I thought about is that, we've had our Stanley Cup, which is probably more revered than the Lombardi Trophy. It's not bigger because, football is bigger, but, it's been around forever. Everything else that's been in the bottom of the pool. That's been in places where it shouldn't have, and it's all kind of in the spirit of it. So to me, that's just part now of the Lombardi lore. Right. That Tom Brady, made a pass with the Lombardi.
He's taken some heat from some people for being disrespectful.
Well, I think the one that drew attention was the daughter of the engraver. Thought it was disrespecting the trophy, but
she wanted an apology.
Yeah, I don't think the Penguins meant to disrespect the Stanley Cup when it ended up in the bottom of Mario's pool.
Yeah, exactly. It's the exact opposite. I mean, the Stanley Cup is there's so much lore behind it. Like some of the unwritten rules, you can't touch it unless you actually win it when you're a player, right? Like, so there's no respect for a trophy because you've tossed it. You've had a few cocktails and you toss it from one boat to the next. I mean, the work that Tom Brady puts in to win that trophy, I mean, that's the respect. I think that shows how much that trophy means to him. So,
right,
yeah,
right. Well, we've gone a lot longer than we normally do, but we hope you've enjoyed this show. I wanted to pay tribute to Frank Gore, and I thought Bob Duff's stories helped us do that. It's always good to have Bob around, and it's this Monday. We got another show to do on Wednesday. We'll have another guest. We'll get into some other hockey topics. Hopefully, we won't be talking about COVID. I am really weary of talking about COVID.
Yeah.
So let's hope that we're moving forward. And one thing I wanted to throw out at the end here, it is COVID related. I saw, and I meant to ask you this before, and if I would have found my notes, I would have asked you this. Our friend Helene Elliott wrote a column in which she suggested perhaps it's time now that we had 48 games, or at least she said it on Facebook, but I think it was in a column as well. 48 games. Season, just cut it down, and that way we wouldn't be chasing games late in the year, and we wouldn't end up with crazy things like 3 games in 3 nights or anything like that. So everybody just take one game off, so be it 48.
Well, I guess that kind of teams going to look and say, okay, which teams are we going to be losing off our schedule? Like somebody that's going to play a team like Ottawa that's not playing very well right now is going to say, well, I don't want to lose those games. I don't want to play the good teams more than the bad teams. That's going to be the problem.
Well, with 48 on the games, if you've got a 7-team, you just eliminate one from every team.
Right.
So
that's true. Yeah.
It won't be simple though. You're right.
Yeah.
There'll be a fairness issue that everybody will.
Did she break it down? Is she looking at the numbers and saying how we're going to pack in these games from all these teams?
Well, yeah, and we all know. I mean, you don't have to be to understand that there are several teams that have a bunch of games to make up, and it's just going to be hard to do it. But I kind of thought I liked the idea at first, but the more I thought about it, I think we got to kind of wait and see kind of what happens.
Yeah,
maybe with the new protocols and the increased awareness. Not that they didn't know before, but I don't think anybody expected that we would have this many.
But you do kind of wonder, right? Like, the numbers, I guess the numbers are going down, but then again, there's all these new strains. But like they said in New York, they're letting them have 10% capacity. I don't know if that makes sense or not. But
yeah, I'm almost ready to give up. And all I know is that this Friday I'll have my second shot, and then 2 weeks after that, in theory, I'm 95% safe.
There you go.
So, and I hope everybody gets like that, and got to hope for the best. But it's so hard. I mean, it just seems like it's a moving target with the different strains that are coming forward, and it doesn't. Even though the numbers are down, it seems like when every day on Facebook I'm reading with a friend of mine who's lost somebody or knows somebody who passed away. It's just ridiculous. So, anyway, we appreciate everyone for. Tuning in. As I mentioned before, Bob Duff and I have hockeydebates.com podcast every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. at that website. And Tom, tell them where to find this.
Yep. For the radio version of this show, you can go to radio.co at 365 Sports. Again, that's radio.co 365 Sports. See you guys on Wednesday.